Ultimately, I do believe that this is an election that is about strength versus weakness,
Yeah.
and weakness as projected by someone who puts himself in front of the American people and does not have the strength to stand in defense of their needs, their dreams, their desires.
Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. If Donald Trump, who lost the 2020 election by 7 million votes and 74 electoral votes, is to win the presidency in 2024, it will be because he digs deeper, not wider. Trump continues to use his MAGA shovel to turn over every rock in search of voters who didn't participate in the last two elections, but buy his message. And more to the point, fear and loathe Kamala Harris. Harris, for her part, spent the week reaching out broadly, including appearances on non-traditional media. Her strategy includes eating into Trump's strongholds, such as rural voters and those focused first and foremost on illegal immigration. Hurricane Helene tore an especially devastating path through the southeastern United States, serving as a reminder of how unpredictable outside forces can upend the dynamics of a campaign, especially in its final weeks. Trump's pitch here was, characteristically, a tissue of brazen lies, such as the claim that the Biden administration was diverting emergency money to fund the entry of illegal immigrant murderers into the country. Trump, of course, lies everywhere, but his lies here not only sought to vilify Harris on wholly fictitious grounds, but also harmed people in desperate need of relief from the hurricane's ravages. To analyze the sharply conflicting approaches of the two campaigns with less than 3 weeks to go before the most consequential election of our lifetimes, we welcome three distinguished political analysts. And they are Bob Shrum, a renowned Democratic strategist. Bob currently serves as the director of the Center for the Political Future at USC, making us colleagues of a sort. He is a former political consultant who worked as a senior advisor to numerous Democratic presidential campaigns.
Glad to be here.
Jon Alter, an award-winning author, filmmaker, columnist, and MSNBC political analyst. He has authored, no, not 5, it's now 6 political and historical books. And in 2021, he launched his Substack, Old Goats, Ruminating with Friends. Tell us about the new book, Jon.
Oh, it's called American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. It comes out later this month. And I was in the courtroom, just a few feet away from the greatest threat to the American Republic in our history for every day. And so it was the most historic trial of the 21st century so far. But I also have a lot of other stuff in the book about my own kind of crisis of faith in the good sense of half of the American public. And then I've got some new stuff about how Nancy Pelosi maneuvered Joe Biden off the ticket.
Speaking of Nancy Pelosi, anybody in the Southern California area tomorrow, Tuesday, she will be coming for the Talking San Diego series to San Diego to talk with me at the Balboa Theater at 7 o'clock. Anyway, it was a pleasure being with you at that trial, and it's indelible, just the visual image of being behind him. That's a whole nother podcast. Mara Liasson is a national political correspondent for NPR. Her reports can be heard regularly on NPR's programs Morning Edition and All Things Considered. She's covered 7 presidential elections. Before her current assignment, she was NPR's White House correspondent for all 8 years of the Clinton administration. Welcome back, Mara.
Thank you very much.
All right, so both campaigns picked up their media activity this week, but in diametrically opposed ways. Let's start with Harris, who was everywhere, traditional and cutting edge, from 60 Minutes to Howard Stern to Call Her Daddy. Let's start here. Is it smart? She's had this extensive criticism, especially from traditional media, that she's not out there enough. But does answering those critics win her any votes? And there's always the risk of a slip in October. What do you think about her bumped up media strategy?
Well, I guess I'll start. Look, I don't think it wins her any votes because she's finally, according to the press, talking to the press. There's no more self-regarding institution in America than the political press. And they created this issue. She's not doing what she's doing to satisfy them. Unlike Donald Trump, who's talking only to his base, she's reaching out. So she goes on a podcast that has 5 million listeners, many of whom are not very constant voters. They may vote, they may not vote. She's trying to mobilize them. She's just doing a variety of things. I mean, 60 Minutes was obvious. Every presidential candidate except Donald Trump has done it since 1968. But all the others, I think, are designed to reach people that she might not otherwise reach. And, I listened to that podcast. You learned a lot about her in that podcast.
Call Her Daddy, that one?
Yeah. You learned a lot about her. You learned a lot about her life, her values, what she wants to do. It wasn't a series of gotcha questions. It was a series of kind of interesting questions that opened up insight into who she was and what she believes.
I see. And, her personal story, she's led with it, including at the convention. So maybe that's the idea. Mar, you were nodding in agreement?
I think what she's doing is smart. I agree with Bob. This has nothing to do with what journalists want. She's not on these shows to, quote, make news. That's what we want. What she wants is to reach people like Southern women, call her daddy, like All the Smoke, Black men. I mean, there are a lot of key groups that she needs to reach. And in terms of Donald Trump only doing, quote, friendly interviews, his theory of the case is just different. He believes that all he has to do is goose his base. It did work in 2016. And his campaign believes that there are many, many more white working class voters that have not turned out before, but that he can get them out. And some people call this a cable news business model. You don't need a bigger audience. You just need the ones you got watching you 24/7. He doesn't need to reach out to the center or reach out to swing voters or independents. And guess what? The polls show working pretty good for him so far.
I mean, there is a risk, right? She got, for instance, on The View, she said, what would you have done differently from Biden? Not a thing that comes to mind. And I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact. Does that undercut her claim to be the candidate of change? Or, well, John, what do you think? Do you concur with Bob and Mara? This is smart politics?
Oh, it's totally smart politics. I mean, I agree. A lot of my colleagues are whiny. It's not whether they get an interview. It's ridiculous. It's obviously bad for people like me. I mean, I remember, this is going back to 1984. I wouldn't go on a candidate's plane as a Newsweek columnist if I didn't get an interview with the candidate. It used to be completely different. I interviewed Bill Clinton 7 times when he was president, So it's a different world, but it doesn't make any sense for older guys like me to complain about this new world. They're doing what's in their political interest and they're right to do it. The only thing I would disagree with what's been said is I do think it makes sense for her to try to make some news in these appearances so that she can stay on the offensive, keep talking about the future. She tried to do that on The View by talking about this new proposal she has for home health care to address the so-called sandwich generation, the people who can't afford to pay for their aging parents to be in assisted living and sort of subsidize them getting help at home. This is the kind of thing that I think she wanted to have the big story out of that appearance. Unfortunately, it did become this issue of separating herself from Biden, and Trump is now using a clip from The View, that clip, in his rallies. So she tried on Colbert to come back at that, kind of fix that a little bit. It's crazy that with this torrent of lies, this lava of lies from the other side, that, her kind of slightly muffing a question on The View, but that's the world we're living in. I do think she needs a better answer on that. I'd be really interested in what Bob would advise she should say about separating herself from Joe Biden. Now, Hubert Humphrey, had a much bigger problem. It wasn't until 1968 that he separated himself from Lyndon Johnson in the war. if he had done it a little earlier, he would have won the election. It was really close with Nixon. So she's not in that situation where she has to break with him, but she has to figure out a way to tell the voters that they're not getting Biden redux. And I mean, I think she should say, of course I disagreed with him. A lot of it was private disagreements. You think I should tell you where we disagreed? Bob Woodward said in his book, my advice was, quote, shrewd, but, Biden didn't take it all the time. So that's one of the things I would suggest. But I think she's going to get asked that again. And Bob, what would you suggest that she say?
I like your quoting Woodward. I think that's a good idea. Humphrey, September 24th, Salt Lake City, gave a speech where it's very funny. It shows you how consultants can have an impact. Bob Squire, who was his media consultant, when he finished the first take, Squire was worried that he had emphasized his reservations about breaking with Johnson instead of actually doing it.
And we're talking about the Vietnam War, just so everyone knows. Huge.
Yeah, why don't you pump up that one paragraph and come down a little on the other paragraph? And Humphrey said, why? He said, well, it's just going to be better. That's all he said. But of course, he used the second take. So the headline was, Humphrey breaks with Johnson. I think she should, in addition to what you suggest, say, look, I have a lot of things I want to do that we didn't do in this administration. And that if I had had my way, I think we would have done some of them. I love the idea of the home health care. It did actually get a huge amount of attention in social media. It wasn't a big news story, but it got a lot of attention in social media. But I think that's what she has to do. She can't say, I repudiate a lot of the Biden administration. Won't work. Now, beyond that, I think this isn't just about issue positions, and I think it's Trump's mistake. Just playing that clip isn't going to do that for him. She embodies change, literally. And in terms of her age, she looks like change. And if you look at some of the polling, she's now leading on who's change. So I think there's a way forward for her to distinguish herself from Biden without breaking with Biden.
She also did say, she finally came back at the end of The View and said, I would put a Republican in the cabinet. That's one thing Biden didn't do. I was actually shocked. That is such an obvious question to anticipate.
Right.
I agree with that. I mean, you should be prepared for that question. But on the other hand, I got to say, this is someone who came into this race and had to build the plane while flying it. And there have been very few mistakes. It's been a really good campaign.
And all that's true. I will say this is not a huge flub, although I agree with you, Maura. There's not a thing that comes to mind. Remember when they asked Dwight Eisenhower what Richard Nixon has done as vice president?
Give me a week and I might think of something.
Yeah.
Here's something that struck me. She's also trying to do besides policy stuff. And I agree that home health care makes sense, but it's really, as Bob says, what she embodies and how she, the story she's presenting. She is trying hard, it seems to me, and strategically to show herself as a candidate and a person of strength, and actually to paint Trump as a candidate of weakness, which she, said during her interview with Howard Stern. And possibly that's as the first would-be woman president. But given that the way Trump is trying to disparage her, is she basically making that sale completely credible commander-in-chief, strong leader?
She is trying as hard as she can. The word that jumped out to me in her convention speech was lethal.
Yeah, me too.
And then later, you come into my house, I'm going to shoot.
Totally. Oh, I just said that. Oops, it slipped out.
Look, a woman has a huge hurdle, commander-in-chief thing. And Trump's whole thing is, I'm a strong man. Now, we can argue about what that means, but he exudes strength and aggressiveness. She's 5'4" and female, and she's got big hurdle.
But I don't think she is exploiting opportunities enough on that front. So Trump is dodging the debate. She needs to be out there every day hammering him as a chicken. He's pretending to be strong. He's weak. He won't even. She did say it to my face. She said it a couple of times. She needs to say it every day. He's a chicken. I don't think that she is calling him a liar enough and in imaginative enough ways.
A weakling is what you want her to call him.
Borrow the chicken suit from an earlier campaign. Have the chicken show up at every Trump event.
I know that's been done in like 4 or 5 cycles. Like,
right.
Where's the chicken suit?
She did have the plane, right, saying he's punting on the debates.
Yeah, but what she does it once, and then she thinks she's done it. She has to be on the offensive every day. This is what Trump understands. He's never on the defense. He's on the offensive every single day, and she has to do it in a more cutting way.
So you're saying even more importantly than portraying herself as a candidate of strength is to portray him as a weakling.
A weakling and a liar and a hurricane of hate, a litany of lies, a torrent of untruth. Like, use a little like William Sapphire, Vic Gold.
Nabobs of negativity.
Because alliteration, as Bob knows, sticks. And she's not making it stick that he's just been lying his butt off about the hurricane. And, she says it, but not in a way that is breaking through. Now, what they're worried about is liar, liar, pants on fire. And people like the three of us remember that in 1988, it really hurt Bob Dole when asked by Tom Brokaw on the night he lost the New Hampshire primary, do you have any words for Vice President Bush? And he said, stop lying about my record, and he looked bad. But that's not the situation now, because George Bush wasn't a big liar. Trump is. And so she needs to call him out as a liar every day. The other reason that she has to do that is she's taking on water with this gender-affirming surgery for undocumented prison inmates. It is frickin' killing her. And this ad is really harmful. I think her only response to it is to say, look, you can't believe a single word out of this guy's mouth. The billionaires buying his ads, the ads are lies. His speeches are lies. If you see something on TV, it might be AI. You can't believe anything that comes from the Trump camp. So if you see an ad on TV and it says all this terrible stuff about Kamala Harris, don't believe it. It's not true.
You know who did that brilliantly? Ronald Reagan in his debate with Jimmy Carter. Everybody thinks there you go again was just about Social Security and Medicare, but it indicted everything that Carter had said in the debate, even though Carter was telling the truth about most of those things. And it reassured people that Reagan wasn't going to dismantle Social Security, wasn't going to dismantle Medicare, wasn't going to become a warmonger. So I agree that she ought to do that. One thing I would say in her defense, by the way, is the most critical test of whether or not she was strong and he was weak, and whether she could be commander-in-chief, was that debate. And she passed the hurdle in that debate. She passed the threshold on whether she could be president, be commander-in-chief. But I agree, she has to reinforce it constantly. Politics is not about what happened a month and a half ago. Politics is about what happens today.
I agree with John, but I think the problem with the gender-affirming surgery is she did come out for that. Huge mistake in hindsight. But I think much more important is to attack him as a weakling, because you want to attack his biggest strength, and his biggest strength is that he's a strong man. The chicken suit thing, and he won't debate me, and he just switches his policies depending on what billionaire he talked to this morning. I think she could be doing more of that.
All right, let's move to Trump, and I'd actually like to stick with you, Mara, because of the point you made. We've been scratching our heads for weeks, but it does seem apparent if there's a method to the madness or to the absolute staying in extreme MAGA mode, it is this notion that somehow in the recesses, in the dark corners somewhere, there are more of the same, and those are the people who could somehow appear, and they are his equivalent of the whatever suburban voters or new Americans that Harris wants to reach. Can you flesh that out a little, and if you have a sense, sort of speak to its likelihood?
He won that way in 2016. She is not back to where Joe Biden's numbers were with the groups she needs at this point in the race, like young people, voters of color, male African Americans, male Hispanics. I mean, she's not where she needs to be. So I think for the Trump campaign, it makes perfect sense to think there are a lot more low propensity, white non-college, whatever you want to call these voters, they're out there. And because he is a kind of white non-college turnout machine, he can get them.
Wait, are you saying voters who voted in 2016 but not 2020? You're saying actually voters who voted in neither, right? A whole nother pocket?
There's a lot of different levels of low propensityness. So I was just talking to a state party chair. People who voted in 16, 18, 20, and 22 go to Harris. Those are high propensity voters. Trump tends to win people who have missed a couple cycles. So rural white voters, those are the ones Trump is focused on. Now, of course, Mother Nature has a vote here, too. In North Carolina and Georgia, by Helene, are the ones that are most Republican. So I don't know what effect that's going to have. Are they going to be more interested in cleaning out their homes or looking for the polling place that washed away in the flood? I don't know.
There's another Mother Nature issue, which has always been one of the dumber things that Trump has done by dissing early voting. If there's bad weather on election day in battleground states, his whole election day strategy suffers. But I do think he has a big advantage with these low propensity voters. People never mention that in presidential elections, roughly 130 million Americans vote. In off-year elections, in midterm elections, 80 to 90 million Americans vote. That's a huge difference. And it's one that advantages him, as do registration figures that just boggle my mind that in recent years in Pennsylvania and Arizona, at least, those are the ones, and Georgia as well, I think, there have been more Republican registrations than Democratic registrations. But having said that, I do think there are opportunities for Harris to get what you might call the Haley vote. You had a big chunk of Republicans who voted for Nikki Haley after she got out of the race. And so there are, like, Biden carried Bucks County with 52%, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Harris can do better than that in Bucks County. She can even do better than he did in Montgomery County. The reason I'm mentioning these specific counties, because these are the ones that hold the key to Pennsylvania for Harris. So Biden got 62% in this formerly Republican county outside of Philadelphia. If she can get that up, 65%, there are mother loads of votes in those areas. So when I get to thinking that Trump has these structural advantages, I remember that there are some advantages for Harris.
I agree and disagree. I agree that she has these opportunities. And in fact, if you believe it, there's a Reuters Ipsos poll which shows her winning the suburbs by 6 points. That would be unheard of. I mean, it's just, it doesn't happen for Democrats. Biden did better in the suburbs, but he didn't do nearly that well. Where I think I might disagree is Trump does things and then we try to construct a post hoc rationale for them. And that post hoc rationale can be, well, sure, he's doubling down on his base because there are a lot more voters out there that he can get. The truth is, I think if he had reached out more, if he had given that convention speech the way they wrote it, not what he did 15 minutes in, he looked out at the hall, the people weren't going crazy. It was probably working in the country. So he just threw it away and went back to his stump speech. And suddenly he wasn't the unifying candidate anymore. What in the world is he doing, holding a rally at Madison Square Garden and then another rally in the Coachella Valley down in Palm Desert? It's crazy politics. It reminds me of Nixon going to Alaska and spending 2 days at the end of the 60 campaign on keeping this goofy pledge to campaign in all 50 states. I think he said, I'm going to New York. I'm going to California. I'm going to hold rallies there. And then people say, well, maybe he's trying to do this to help the Republican candidate, Ken Calvert, the incumbent congressman, down in the Coachella Valley against the Democrat, Will Rollins, who's running a very competitive campaign. I don't think that's it at all. I don't think he knows who Ken Calvert is or cares. I think he said, I want to go to the Coachella Valley. I can win California. If Jesus counted the votes, and I think I'm quoting him, if Jesus counted the votes, I would have won California the last time. He's crazy.
I want to just say, first of all, I can't agree with Bob Moore. We imbue these candidates with these rational powers, or they know something we don't know. Sometimes they're just, doing whatever they want. And it makes no sense. But something about the new registrations that John pointed out. It's true that overall the registration numbers have been coming up, although some of those people have been voting Republican for many years, even though they were registered as Democrats. But the other new registration story is that tremendous numbers of young women and people of color have been registering recently. Maybe it's Taylor Swift. Maybe it's just the excitement of Kamala Harris. And a new registrant is more likely to vote than someone who's been registered for a number of years.
So let me ask you a question about this, because there was all this publicity about Taylor Swift. The last number I saw was that she'd gotten 500,000 people around the country to register, and that's not very many, spread across 50 states. So have you seen any numbers?
I don't know, but if they're in the right places, they'll make a difference.
Yeah, but what I don't know and haven't seen, and
I haven't seen that either, the state by state breakdown of that.
Yeah, I'd like to see what the recent registration.
But it's not just the numbers that of new registrants. But let me get your thoughts, though. As a political strategist, I just scratch my head. Who's the white, non-college educated voter who sat out 2016, who sat out 2020, but now is like, I'm going to the polls for Trump. Is there, to use Mara's word, a motherlode of such people, or is it just that it's his only shot? He's not going to change his spots, and so that's a kind of a hope.
I believe that Mara's right, that there's a motherlode of people like that. I mean, Jonathan gave the figures earlier about all the people who don't vote in midterms, who vote in presidential elections, and then there's another whole tens of millions of people who are eligible to vote in presidential elections and don't. But I suspect that if they didn't vote in 2016 and they didn't vote in 2020, it's going to be hard to get them to go out there and vote. We have a situation here where I believe there's no longer a shy Trump voter. I don't think people are ashamed to say they're for Trump. In fact, I think they're rather proud to say it. And so I suspect that the polls, which are very close, are pretty accurate right now, at least within the margin of error. I mean, we often look at these polls and we say, oh, Trump's ahead by 2 points in Pennsylvania. You know what that means? That means they're tied in Pennsylvania because it's all margin of error stuff.
And microcosms, little places in the T and the suburban ring
Right.
And stuff, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Helene. And, you mentioned early on, John, how nature strikes. Mara, you said on NPR that you think Helene can work both ways politically.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on the point? What are the two potential political impacts, and which do you see emerging?
Hurricane relief is a test for presidents, and they can fail it or pass it. And, George H.W. Bush failed in Andrew, and Barack Obama succeeded in Sandy. And that's why Trump went after Harris immediately for doing a lousy job asleep at the wheel. You're sending the money to counties that don't have Republicans, and then that's all the misinformation. They'll only give you $750. If a relief worker comes, they're going to confiscate your property. I mean, so that's one political battle. Hurricanes have been completely politicized. But then there's the more practical effect of how is it going to affect election day? People getting to the polls. Many polling stations are probably washed away. And a lot of those counties are Republican. In North Carolina and Georgia, they're rural kind of counties in the hills where Helene hit. And that could hurt Trump. And what's so interesting to me is that last time the Trump campaign was very upset and filed a lot of lawsuits that said that the changes in voting rules to deal with the pandemic were somehow unconstitutional and was proof that the election was rigged against him. Now I think they're going to be pushing hard for rules that will make it easier for people in hurricane hit areas to vote.
I'm much more worried about this phenomenon that Mark Twain noticed a long time ago, that a lie makes it halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And it's just such a flood of lies. And their strategy is to flood the zone with lies. You literally can't keep up with it. And, you can see that on Barack Obama's face at his speech in Pittsburgh. Like, where do I begin? The lies, they just come at you fast and furious. And people believe them until they're told that they're not true. And it's very, very expensive and hard to catch up with the untrue lies. So there are people in all parts of the country who think that, Biden's only giving him $750, or, he's favoring areas that favored him, or he's giving the money to migrants. People believe this. And the proof that people believe it is the pet story in Springfield. So when there were all these memes and everybody was making fun of Trump after the debate over that, I was thinking, you know what? The people who were saying, well, it's bad for Harris because anytime they're talking about immigration is bad for the Democrat. My reaction was, come on, like, these lies are so preposterous. The Republican governor of Ohio is contesting them. This can't possibly work for Trump. But I think it did hold down what should have been a bigger post-debate bounce for Harris, because the conversation was about immigration. And it doesn't even matter that much whether people believed the lies or not. They were talking about immigration. And they're very skillful at doing this. They double down on their lies. They never back off an inch, and it works for them.
And they make everything about immigration. They'll make the World Series about immigration. It's just, you could see it when Trump was off balance in the debate, just immigration, right?
I want to make a larger point about what's happened to our politics. I think we've entered the era of the big lie. It used to be, if you were running a campaign, you were the strategist in a campaign, you were making ads, you really worried that the ad that you made, the assertion that was made in a speech, had to at least be defensible, had to pass some kind of smell test. And you worried about how the media were going to react to it. Well, were they going to say this is a lie? That's all gone. We've entered a time when it's no longer true, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, that everybody's entitled to their own opinions. No one's entitled to their own facts. Now everybody has their own facts. Everybody has their own network. I can create a network on this thing. And Trump, he kind of introduced that in 2016, but he's taken full advantage of it. And I think at some level, you can't spend the whole campaign just batting down his lies. You got to go out there and give people a positive reason why they should vote for you. That's what I think she's been trying to do, talking about middle class economics. We referred to it earlier, talking about home health care, talking about the kinds of things, tax cuts for ordinary people that matter. Now, that being said, it is also the case that it will motivate his voters to go out and vote when he bangs the drum on immigration. And that's what he's trying to do, because there's not much else he can say.
I totally agree, Bob, the way our politics has changed. Harry, I don't know if you were in the courtroom of the hush money trial when they were talking about what they call the Trump Tower conspiracy. This is where Trump and David Pecker got together, and it didn't really get noticed at the time. To Bob's point, basically for many generations, you could make really serious charges about your opponents, but if they were total lies, it hurt you, right? So Trump decided he was shameless enough to do that. So they started make up these lies. It started in the Republican primaries in 2016. Ted Cruz's father was with Lee Harvey Oswald. Marco Rubio is gay. And Trump himself would approve these National Enquirer stories, and he cackling over them. And he paid no penalty. In fact, those Rubio and Cruz, being even weaker than Trump, eventually danced to his tune. But something fundamental changed in American politics in 2016. And I write about this in American Reckoning. It's a huge, huge change.
And I just want to add, we talk about this in political terms, and Rubio and Cruz had to withdraw from the race. These are lies with really palpable and, in many cases, extreme human cost people not getting relief, people not knowing what's out there, people completely losing confidence that the government will look out for them in these most, strenuous of times. So these are pernicious lies that go beyond just his sort of political cynicism, it seems to me.
Harry, there's someone complaining on, I think it's on Twitter, and they're very frustrated that their father, who lives in North Carolina and who suffered a lot of damage, won't take any help from FEMA because he believes now that FEMA will come and take his house away if he accepts help. So there are real world consequences to this. But writ large, the real world consequence is that you could elect again someone who is completely unfit to be president of the United States, basically because he's a pretty good liar.
Harris has what I think is a really good ad with Mark Esper, General Milley, John Bolton. And it's basically playing to the many voters who, when you talk to them, they say, well, what I really care about are the people around the president. You hear that all the time from voters. Who are the people around him? So this ad really goes at that and says the people around Trump think he's unfit. Would you put a lot of money behind that ad? Would you keep it in heavy rotation? How important is that message?
Well, I don't have the data that they have, but I think the ad is designed to get these swing voters, the suburbanites that I talked about earlier, who now favor Harris, if you believe the Reuters Ipsos poll, by 6 points. So you would target it to those folks. I don't think it's going to peel away, for example, people who are already committed to vote for Trump. But I think it does have an impact on suburban voters, on higher information voters. Look, there are a lot of college-educated people who are going to vote for Kamala Harris who have in the past generally voted Republican. They're the kinds of people that you direct that ad to.
And, I have a question about that. You talk about, don't think that there's a shy Trump voter anymore because there's no stigma. There is a theory that there are shy Haley voters who don't want to say they're going to vote for Harris. Actually, our reporting from NPR is that there are a lot of women because their husbands are voting for Trump. They don't want to tell them.
That, of course, would distort the polling, especially if you're doing telephone polling and you've got the wife on the phone and you want to know who she's going to vote for, and the husband who's for Trump is sitting there. She's not going to say Harris. But then she gets into the polling place, she can do whatever she wants.
Don't we think in general that the election is turning on so few, almost communities, not even states, microcosms within states, that certainly national polls, but even the snapshot Pennsylvania polls just are not very informative. We obsess about them and consume them in all their details, but it feels like it's mad poll disease.
I agree with that. And there's one other thing about the polling that ought to be said, because it happened in 2022, to a lesser extent in 2020. You're having a lot of junk polls come in now. They're being put into the averages, and it actually seems to be a Republican tactic to come up with polls that say we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And you do that by weighting the poll a certain way. I mean, there's one yesterday that said that Harris was ahead in Pennsylvania, I don't know, by 4 or 5 points among all voters, but was behind by 1.5 points among registered voters. And it turns out that there were only 12 people in Philadelphia who made it through the screen of likely voters. Well, that's a junk poll. It ought to be thrown out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them, and the Republicans have a very different approach. They work the refs in a new way. They tell people it's over, we've won. Whereas Democrats are like in the fetal position. They're depressed. And Simon Rosenberg, who is the only prominent guy who called 2022, he said the red wave was a mirage, and he was correct. I'm not saying he's necessarily going to be correct this time, because I don't think he takes enough account of low propensity voters, but he makes a lot of good arguments. And he says it's like psyops on Democrats, that Democrats are performing on themselves. They're like hurting themselves by wringing their hands so much, and they have to stop wringing hands and start ringing doorbells. And I'm less interested in the polls, although I'm addicted to them, I have to admit, than in factors that people don't normally think about. And just to mention two that could favor Democrats, overseas voters. They are heavily Democratic. These are people who are living abroad, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands. And Democrats abroad is much stronger than Republicans abroad. And, I talked to somebody from Democrats abroad, and they have a lot of votes that they're expecting in battleground states are going to come in that nobody is polling for. Obviously, you're not calling, abroad. Another factor that I'm looking at is the COVID effect. More Trump voters died of COVID than Biden voters. And they were older, white, less well-educated, less willing to take the vaccine, and more of them died. And there's some new data that I'm starting to analyze about that. It's hard to get too granular, but it's going to be at least a minor factor.
I had a pollster tell me that we're a deeply divided, evenly divided country. The closer the polls are, the margin of error is actually larger. That's another factor to consider. And just one other thing about Democrats and Republicans. So, of course, Democrats go into the fetal position. That's their default position. And Republicans just say, we're going to win no matter what. And actually, chilling thing any Republican ever told me, which was way back in 2020, and this is a pretty high up Trump person, they said, we can't lose a close race.
They're preparing the ground for saying if they lose, the election was stolen, and we know it was stolen because actually the polls showed we were going to win.
As a lawyer, I'm here to tell you what's happening on the election front is truly terrifying. It's now time for our sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues and relationships that are prominent in the news. Today, we are going to talk about how the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico could become states under the Constitution. And to do the explaining, we have the great fortune of welcoming one of America's great actresses and comedians, Cecily Strong. Cecily has, since 2012, been a cast member on SNL, where she has created a series of indelible characters, including the girl you wish you hadn't started a conversation with at a party, and Janine Pirro, that are hilarious and heartwarming at the same time. For her work on SNL, she was nominated for an Outstanding Supporting Actress Emmy in 2020. Cecily also can be seen in Ghostbusters, The Boss, and can be heard in the animated comedy series The Awesomes. And now I give you Cecily Strong on D.C. and Puerto Rico's statehood.
How did D.C. and Puerto Rico become states? The House of Representatives voted to make D.C. a state. That represents a step to D.C. becoming a state. But how does a territory become a state, and how might this play out for D.C. and Puerto Rico, another territory that may soon join the Union? The Constitution gives Congress the power to admit new states. It exercised its power by passing a law admitting the state just as it would any ordinary legislation. Like ordinary legislation, the law needs to get at least 51% in the House, survive any filibuster in the Senate, and be signed into law by the President. Historically, there have been two main routes that territories have been admitted into the Union. One method has Congress first pass what is called an Enabling Act. The Enabling Act gave preliminary approval to statehood and authorized the territory to draft a constitution and apply for statehood. Once the application was submitted, Congress voted to admit or reject the state. The other route is known as the Tennessee Plan. Under this route, the territory takes it upon itself to organize the Constitution and elect a state-like government. It then holds a referendum on statehood and uses the results of that referendum to petition Congress for admission. Both D.C. and Puerto Rico have sought admission through this Tennessee Plan method. Indeed, the case for making them states is compelling. Both D.C. and Puerto Rico are larger than several previously admitted states, and each have held local referenda in which the populations have chosen statehood. Many of the arguments against statehood are simply partisan concerns that the states would elect Democratic representatives, if not outright racist appeals to suppress the votes of non-white voters. Some have argued that the Constitution precludes the admission of D.C. as a state because it authorizes a federal district as the seat of government. The current admission legislation appears to avoid this concern, however, by reserving a small 2-mile federal district surrounding the capital and converting the rest of the city into the 51st state called Douglas Commonwealth in honor of Frederick Douglass. One potential issue with this plan is that the 23rd Amendment currently gives 3 electoral votes for president to the federal district. Should the rest of D.C. be admitted as a state, the Douglas Commonwealth would be entitled to 3 electoral votes. That would leave the residents of the federal district, essentially the president and his family, in sole control of the other 3 electoral votes. The admitting legislation calls for the repeal of the 23rd Amendment, but unless that happens, that could make for some awkward electoral math. For Talking Feds, I'm Cecily Strong.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we discuss adding the right amount of water to a glass of whiskey without turning it into a whiskey river. The thought of adding water to any golden brown whiskey might bring tears to the eyes of some whiskey drinkers. But for others, adding a few drops of water to your glass has its merits and actually improves and enhances the flavor. The phrase "open up" refers to the release of the extra flavor you taste by adding those drops of water. And here's a little bit of science that helps reinforce that theory. When water is added to whiskey, it releases the guaiacol, which is partially responsible for the smoky and spicy flavor. When guaiacol is released, it rises to the surface so the aromas are more easily noticeable, allowing your palate to experience the smell and flavor that imparts on the drink. And while there's really no right or wrong way, some say adding a splash of water brings out the best in your glass of whiskey. Of course, going overboard with the water has diminishing returns, watering down the whiskey and proving once again that moderation almost always wins. So the next time you're thirsting for a little experimenting of your own, stop into your local Total Wine and More for a whiskey selection that suits every budget. And that's a scientific fact. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine and More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. I want to just end with your thoughts on an aspect of the biggest tug of war, which is immigration. So Vance in Arizona, where early voting has already started, is pitching to Latino voters, arguing that, it's in their interest to have this massive deportation that Trump plans. Harris held a town hall in Las Vegas last week and again touted here's the great bill that we wanted to do and Trump killed it. But she also tried to be more empathetic, but also talk kind of tough. Who's winning the immigration tug of war?
Trump.
Well, yeah, look, immigration is an issue that naturally favors Trump. That's why he talks about it all the time. I said earlier, he doesn't have much else to talk about. I mean, he can say the stock market's going up because they think I'm going to win. That's not a very persuasive argument. It's not going to move a lot of people. So everything gets taken back to immigration.
So I think the bill, the Langford bill, which under normal circumstances, nobody would care about. It's a bank shot, right? Getting voters to pay attention to some bill on Capitol Hill is very, very difficult under normal circumstances. But after Labor Day in a presidential election is one of the only times when you can actually get a message through on something like this. And I think Harris has gotten that message through. Now, she's still going to lose, but what she's been able to do is not get the advantage on immigration. But it's like her going after rural votes. You're not trying to win on immigration. You're trying to cut his margins on immigration. And I think there's something to suggest that she might be doing that. And also, while there are real problems with the Latino vote that are of particular concern to Democrats in Pennsylvania, Nevada is an interesting case because Biden was very unpopular there. And it looked like Jackie Rosen was going to lose her Senate seat. And there's been a big turnaround there, and it's much more comfortably democratic than it was a year ago. So, I think the Latino vote is a little more fluid than people realize. It's very turnout related. There is a machismo thing that I've talked to Latino voters about that's very real, that hurts Harris, but it's up for grabs in ways that are very important for the future of American politics because that constituency is growing so fast.
There you have it at T-minus 22 days and counting. We just have a minute or two for our final feature of Talking Five, where we take a question and each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. Today's question comes from Marjorie Taylor Greene. Haven't heard about her all that much lately, but she recently claimed the Biden administration was controlling the weather, referring to Hurricane Helene. So question is, how will the government next use its astonishing powers?
Blizzards in red areas on election day.
I'll say, in the spirit of Marjorie Taylor Greene, government magically closes wealth gap.
I would say government lasers cure cancer.
That's so good for Marjorie Taylor Greene. Okay, and I will say, actually make the weather warmer. Thank you so much, Jon, Mara, and Bob. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McCardle, Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahendranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Neuker are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Thanks so much to Cecily Strong for explaining how DC and Puerto Rico could become states. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.